When someone shows you who they are, believe them.
My wife Amanda worked at a rapidly growing consulting firm specializing in compliance and risk management. She'd been there for 3 years and was desperately trying to break into senior leadership. When the annual Investor Gala invitation came, she was over the moon because it meant FaceTime with C-suite executives and potential investors who could make or break careers. For weeks leading up to the event, Amanda prepared like it was her doctoral defense. She researched every attendee, practiced elevator pitches in our bathroom mirror, and spent a fortune on a midnight blue dress with a deep emerald shimmer that made her look like she belonged in boardrooms. I supported her completely, helping her rehearse conversations and even role-playing difficult networking scenarios where I'd pretend to be various executives with different personalities and agendas. What she didn't know was that I'd been working behind the scenes at her company for months, essentially saving them from financial disaster. Here's what she never bothered to learn about my work. I run a specialized consulting practice focused on regulatory compliance and crisis management. It's not flashy work, and most clients prefer absolute discretion since hiring me implies they had serious problems that could destroy their reputation if publicized. My typical engagement involves coming in quietly when companies face potential SEC investigations, merger complications, or compliance failures that could obliterate their business overnight. I work in what we call clean rooms, sterile environments where sensitive documents are reviewed without creating traceable records or discoverable communications. 4 months before the gala, Amanda's firm contacted me through an intermediary with a code phrase that indicated extreme urgency and potential federal oversight. They were facing a nightmare scenario that could have triggered federal investigations within weeks. The problems were extensive and interconnected. Sloppy real estate classifications that misrepresented asset values to investors, improper client onboarding protocols that violated several banking regulations, aggressive vendor arrangements that technically weren't violations yet but would have triggered immediate regulatory scrutiny during their upcoming merger evaluation, questionable accounting practices that could have been interpreted as intentional misrepresentation, and compliance gaps in their international transactions that could have attracted Treasury Department attention. Without rapid intervention, they would have failed due diligence spectacularly, potentially facing tens of millions in fines, criminal referrals, loss of their operating licenses, and complete destruction of their acquisition opportunity. I spent 10 weeks essentially rebuilding their entire compliance infrastructure from the ground up. This wasn't simple paperwork shuffling. I had to create parallel accountability systems, restructure their vendor approval processes, develop defensible documentation that could withstand intensive regulatory scrutiny from federal agencies, establish clean internal oversight mechanisms that would prevent future violations, create new client verification protocols that met international banking standards, rebuild their financial reporting systems to eliminate any appearance of manipulation, and essentially create a secondary legal framework that would protect them during the acquisition process. The work required 18-hour days, complete operational secrecy, unlimited access to the most sensitive areas of their business, coordination with their legal team without leaving discoverable communications, and creating documentation systems that could survive the most aggressive forensic accounting reviews. My fee reflected the urgency, complexity, and absolute discretion required. High six figures, paid through encrypted transactions with absolutely no paper trail that could be subpoenaed later. During this intensive engagement, I learned that David Chen, one of the most influential private equity investors on the East Coast, was personally evaluating the firm for a potential $350 million acquisition that would transform them into a major industry player. David operates completely differently than typical investors. He's what insiders call a phantom whale, controlling massive capital while maintaining almost complete public anonymity. When he moves, entire industries reconfigure overnight. Stock prices shift dramatically. Competitors scramble to adapt their strategies. But he never announces his intentions publicly or through traditional financial media channels. His investment philosophy focuses heavily on leadership integrity and corporate culture under pressure, not just financial metrics and growth projections. He's known for conducting what he calls cultural audits, observing leadership teams in unguarded moments to assess their true character when they believe they're not being evaluated. David had already committed to attending their gala, not for networking or publicity, but to conduct a final, comprehensive assessment of their corporate culture and leadership character when executives thought they weren't being evaluated. He specifically requested that I accompany him as an unofficial cultural advisor, wanting my detailed perspective on the management team after having worked so intimately with their operational structure, internal dynamics, and decision-making processes under extreme pressure. I agreed, partly out of professional curiosity about his evaluation methods and partly because I respected his methodical, character-based approach to major investment decisions that could affect thousands of employees. Amanda knew absolutely none of this background information about my work or professional capabilities. To her, I was simply a boring consultant who worked from home, handling unspecified projects she never bothered asking about in detail. She preferred being seen as the ambitious half of our marriage, the one with visible career momentum and impressive networking prowess. I never corrected this perception because it seemed to make her genuinely happy with our dynamic, and frankly, my work often required maintaining an extremely low public profile anyway. She'd even started making subtle jokes about how some people aren't built for growth or leadership challenges, how ambition skips certain personality types, always delivered with a laugh and a shoulder pat that somehow managed to sting, despite her apparent playfulness. Over time, she'd grown comfortable with the narrative that she was the rising star while I was the stable, unexciting foundation, a dynamic that had worked for our marriage until I realized how little she actually valued that foundation. When she received the gala invitation, she was absolutely ecstatic. This represented everything she'd been working toward for years: proximity to real power, recognition for her contributions, and potential advancement opportunities that could reshape her entire career trajectory and finally give her the executive visibility she craved. I congratulated her enthusiastically, helped her choose the perfect dress, and even practiced mock conversations with her where I'd challenge her responses to help her think on her feet and prepare for difficult questions. I never mentioned that David had personally invited me, or that my assessment of the evening might directly influence a deal worth more than her entire department's combined annual budget. The night finally arrived. Amanda looked absolutely stunning, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from months of preparation and genuine ambition. The venue was spectacular, a converted industrial warehouse space with soaring ceilings, magnificent crystal chandeliers, and carefully orchestrated lighting that made everyone look successful and important. The atmosphere buzzed with carefully controlled energy. Servers in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in one corner, and the entire space had been transformed into something that screamed prestige and success. As we walked through the entrance, I could see Amanda mentally cataloging the room, identifying key targets for strategic conversations, and calculating the optimal sequence for her networking approach. She had studied the guest list like a battle plan, knowing exactly who she needed to impress and in what order. The energy was absolutely intoxicating. Everyone was performing their most polished professional selves, voices pitched perfectly between confident and respectful, laughter calibrated to seem genuine while serving careful networking purposes. Amanda thrived in this environment, gliding between conversations with practiced grace, deploying her most charming smile and that infectious laugh that had once been reserved exclusively for our private moments together. She moved through the crowd like someone who had rehearsed this choreography her entire life. Every gesture was calculated for maximum impact. The way she tilted her chin when listening to show engagement, the precise duration of her hand touches on executives' arms to seem warm but professional, the timing of her responses to create just enough pause for gravitas without seeming unprepared. She'd become a master of social code switching, adapting her communication style instantly to match whoever she was addressing, mirroring their energy levels and professional vocabulary. About 90 minutes into the evening, Amanda was deep in animated conversation with the director of strategic planning when her CEO, Robert, approached our small group with obvious purpose and barely concealed anxiety. This was her moment, the face-to-face interaction she'd been preparing for all month, practicing in front of mirrors and rehearsing potential conversation topics. As Robert extended his hand toward me with what appeared to be polite curiosity but was actually careful assessment, Amanda leaned close to my ear and whispered with devastating casualness, "Don't let them think we're married." Those 7 words landed like a physical blow to my chest, snapping something that felt like a wire pulled too tight. She delivered them with such calculated cruelty, accompanied by her most dazzling smile for Robert's benefit. It wasn't nervousness or social anxiety. It was deliberate erasure. She wanted me completely invisible, removed from her narrative of success and professional ascension. Her fingers stayed light on my elbow, just enough pressure to maintain the appearance of politeness while her words cut through any illusion I had about our partnership or her respect for me. I didn't create a scene or show any visible reaction that might embarrass her professionally. I simply let my hand fall from her back like it had become unbearably heavy, stepped away with measured composure, and began walking toward the far corner of the ballroom. Not a single person in their conversation circle even noticed my departure. That was exactly what Amanda had orchestrated. My complete irrelevance to her professional story and future ambitions. But one man noticed everything with clinical precision. David sat alone at a corner table positioned on a slightly raised platform, untouched champagne beside him while he nursed a simple glass of water. No ostentatious jewelry, no flashy accessories, just an expensive but understated charcoal suit and the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room without needing to announce it or seek validation. The table's position wasn't accidental. It provided perfect sight lines across the entire venue while remaining subtly removed from the main social currents. When I reached his table, he offered the subtlest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between men who understand that real power never needs to announce itself or seek external confirmation. His eyes held a calculating quality, like someone used to watching rooms move around him through strategy rather than charisma. I took the seat beside him without invitation or explanation. From our elevated position, we had perfect sight lines across the entire ballroom. Every gesture, every laugh, every strategic positioning was visible from our corner perch. Amanda continued working the room like she was born for it, completely unaware that the fundamental power dynamics had just shifted dramatically around her. She was genuinely magnificent to watch, I have to admit. The way she commanded attention without seeming desperate, the perfectly timed touches on executives' arms, the laugh that made people lean in closer, wanting to be part of whatever made her so confident. She'd mastered the complex social choreography of corporate advancement. I'd helped her develop many of these skills during our marriage, coaching her through networking events, practicing difficult conversations, and celebrating every small victory in her climb toward leadership recognition. But as the evening progressed, something fascinating and subtle began happening around our table. Board members started gravitating toward our corner, not obviously or dramatically, but with careful course corrections that brought them into respectful proximity. The chief financial officer, who'd barely acknowledged my existence at the bar earlier, suddenly appeared beside David and addressed him with unmistakable deference and careful attention. The head of business development, previously focused entirely on schmoozing potential clients, made a deliberate approach and offered the kind of respectful nod usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or federal regulators. One by one, they migrated. Some pretended to refill drinks and veered our direction. Others acted like they were heading toward exits, only to pause accidentally, lock eyes with David, and offer nods so careful they could have been missed entirely. No one lingered too long, but each person left a breadcrumb of acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Amanda remained completely oblivious to this gradual shift in the room's center of gravity. She was too focused on her own carefully choreographed performance, too invested in the conversations directly in front of her to notice the broader patterns emerging across the ballroom. When the VP of operations politely excused himself from her animated discussion to approach our table with obvious nervousness, she simply pivoted to another executive without missing a beat, or questioning why senior people kept drifting away from her orbit. David finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute authority. "She's quite ambitious, your wife." It wasn't a compliment, more like a clinical observation made by someone accustomed to evaluating human behavior under pressure. I nodded silently, uncertain how to respond. He continued watching Amanda work the crowd with the detached interest of a behavioral scientist studying social dynamics in their natural habitat. But she doesn't listen. She performs instead of observing. That's dangerous in leadership positions because it suggests she prioritizes appearance over substance. He was absolutely right, and the accuracy of his assessment hit me like cold water. Amanda had always confused visibility with genuine influence, volume with actual authority. She'd never learned that real power often operates in complete silence, making decisions that reshape entire landscapes without fanfare, announcement, or recognition. She was busy being seen and remembered while missing who actually controlled the outcomes she desperately wanted to influence. As dessert was served and the formal program began with polite applause, David turned to me with a direct question that felt like a comprehensive test. Do you trust her judgment in high-pressure situations? I looked across the room at Amanda, who was animatedly describing some recent project victory to a group that included the head of strategic partnerships and 2 board members. Her gestures were perfect, her timing flawless, her energy infectious, but I realized something fundamental had shifted permanently in my perception of her character and integrity. Not anymore, I replied quietly, the words surprising me with their finality. That's when Amanda finally looked our way. Her eyes found me first, then slowly tracked to David, then registered the cluster of senior executives who had positioned themselves within respectful distance of our table, like planets orbiting a sun. For the first time all evening, her polished performance faltered visibly. Her smile remained frozen in place, but I could see the exact moment of recognition dawning. The realization that she'd completely misread the actual power structure of the room and possibly made a catastrophic error in judgment. She blinked rapidly, said something quick to her conversation partners, and began moving in our direction with obvious purpose and growing anxiety. But by then, several irreversible things had already been set in motion throughout the ballroom. The CEO, who had been circulating confidently all evening, suddenly appeared deeply uncertain when he glanced toward our corner and noticed the careful attention David was receiving from board members. The head of investor relations, previously focused on working the general crowd, now stood slightly apart, watching David with the kind of alert respect usually reserved for auditors or federal investigators. Amanda's approach was intercepted by Robert, the CEO, who materialized beside her with obvious stress etched across his features and sweat visible on his forehead despite the venue's air conditioning. I couldn't hear their conversation from across the room, but I could see his gestures becoming increasingly urgent, while Amanda's expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror. Someone had clearly briefed him on exactly who David was, why his presence at their gala mattered more than every other conversation combined, and what the potential consequences might be if this cultural evaluation went poorly. The evening concluded with polite applause and carefully orchestrated departures. Amanda made several desperate attempts to position herself for a proper introduction to David, but the opportunities never materialized naturally, and forcing them would have appeared unprofessional and desperate. By the time we reached our car, the silence between us was thick with unspoken tensions and unasked questions that neither of us knew how to address. The drive home was absolutely excruciating. Amanda fidgeted constantly with her necklace, a nervous habit she'd never quite overcome despite years of professional polish and presentation training. When we finally reached our house, she kicked off her heels with forced casualness and tried to laugh off the evening's obvious tension. God, that carpet felt like walking on Velcro all night. My feet are absolutely eliminating me. I swear these events get more pretentious every year, don't you think? I said nothing, heading directly to the kitchen for water and space to think. She followed immediately, leaning against the counter with studied nonchalance that didn't fool either of us. So that was pretty intense, right? I get weird at those big events sometimes. Social anxiety kicks in and I start overthinking every single interaction. Not exactly my finest moment, but I think I recovered well enough in the end. Her attempt at self-deprecating humor fell completely flat in the tense atmosphere. I remained silent, which seemed to unnerve her further and accelerate her need to fill the space with explanations. She kept talking, words spilling out faster with each passing second. I mean, you know I didn't mean anything by that comment earlier. It's just politics in those environments, right? You have to read the room carefully, navigate all the relationships and hierarchies. Sometimes you say things that sound wrong out of context but make sense in the moment. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and quiet. Do you know who David Chen is? Amanda blinked in genuine confusion. Who are you talking about? I don't remember meeting anyone by that name. I walked to my laptop, opened it with deliberate slowness, and typed his name into the search engine. The first result was a Wall Street Journal profile titled, "The Phantom Whale: How David Chen Quietly Controls Billions in Private Equity." I clicked through several additional articles, Forbes pieces about his acquisition strategy, Bloomberg analysis of his private equity empire, Fortune coverage of companies he'd transformed or destroyed with single investment decisions, and profiles describing his reputation for character-based evaluations. Amanda read over my shoulder, her breathing becoming progressively more shallow with each paragraph. Portfolio companies worth over $50 billion across multiple industries, acquisition decisions that reshaped entire market sectors, a reputation for abandoning deals at the final moment if leadership culture failed his highly subjective but consistently applied standards for integrity and character under pressure. "That's the man I was sitting with all evening," I said calmly, letting the implications sink in completely. "The man you asked me not to be associated with in public." Amanda's face drained of all color. I didn't know. Nobody told me he was going to be there. The invitation list didn't include detailed investor information or backgrounds. He invited me personally," I continued, watching her process this information. "After I spent 3 months preventing your company from failing its merger evaluation and possibly facing federal investigations that could have destroyed careers and sent executives to prison." The silence that followed was absolutely complete. Amanda opened her mouth several times without producing any sound, like someone whose entire understanding of reality was recalibrating in real time. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was barely audible. "You worked on our compliance files? Our actual company files?" I explained everything then, the crisis her firm had faced without her knowledge, the regulatory violations that could have triggered SEC investigations and destroyed careers, the potential criminal referrals that could have resulted from their accounting practices, the months I'd spent working in complete secrecy to rebuild their entire operational framework and legal standing, how David had specifically requested my cultural assessment of their leadership team before finalizing his $350 million acquisition decision that would determine the future of everyone at the firm. "So when you dismissed me tonight," I concluded, "you weren't just embarrassing your husband in public. You were insulting the person who saved your company from potential federal investigation and possibly destroying the deal that would determine everyone's future there, including your own career advancement opportunities." Amanda collapsed into a chair, her professional composure finally cracking completely. "Is he going to pull out of the acquisition because of what I said about not wanting to seem married to you?" I couldn't answer that question definitively, but we both suspected we already knew the likely outcome based on David's reputation for character-based investment decisions and cultural integrity requirements. The memo arrived at Amanda's office exactly 48 hours later, delivered by courier in a heavy envelope with David's private equity firm's embossed seal. His investment group would not proceed with the acquisition. The language was clinical, devastating, and final. "After thorough cultural assessment and leadership evaluation, we have determined insufficient alignment between the organization's stated values and observed leadership behaviors under social pressure. We strongly recommend comprehensive review of character-based promotion criteria and cultural integrity systems before pursuing future investment partnerships." Amanda called me from her office, crying for the first time in years. The board had initiated an immediate, intensive investigation into what had gone catastrophically wrong during what should have been a routine investor relations event. Security footage from the gala was being professionally reviewed, frame by external consultants. Someone with investigative expertise had already connected her dismissive comment to David's sudden withdrawal, and now she was being treated as the primary cause of their financial catastrophe and institutional humiliation. The investigation was swift and merciless in its thoroughness. Amanda's whispered comment had been captured with perfect clarity on audio surveillance equipment installed near the VIP networking areas for security and liability purposes. The recording was crystal clear. You could hear her confidence, her dismissal, the very tone that David's letter had warned against. By noon, HR had received the audio file. By 2 p.m., legal was involved. By 4:30, a formal internal climate inquiry was initiated. Her professional reputation, carefully constructed over 3 years of dedicated work, crumbled completely in just 3 days. She wasn't fired immediately. That would have been too obvious and potentially created legal complications or wrongful termination claims. Instead, she was systematically marginalized through a process that was both subtle and devastating in its effectiveness. Projects were reassigned without explanation or advance notice. Important strategic meetings were scheduled without her inclusion. Access to client files was quietly revoked through administrative changes. Her input was no longer solicited for strategic decisions. Her office was relocated to a less visible area away from executive floors. Her direct reports were transferred to other managers with vague explanations about restructuring. Her business cards were reprinted without her previous title. Her parking space was reassigned. Her access to executive dining areas was revoked. Even the cleaning staff seemed to avoid her office. Within 2 weeks, she had been effectively isolated from every aspect of meaningful work while technically maintaining her employment status and salary. She was professional poison. Everyone understood that associating with her could damage their own careers. By the end of the month, Amanda had been officially moved to a meaningless audit position with no client contact, no advancement opportunities, and no real responsibilities beyond reviewing old compliance documentation that had already been processed. She came home each day looking progressively smaller and more defeated. The ambitious woman who had commanded rooms and influenced decisions was disappearing, replaced by someone who couldn't meet my eyes when discussing her workday or future prospects. One evening, as she sat staring at yet another reassignment memo that further reduced her responsibilities and removed her from another project, I began quietly packing a bag, not dramatically or angrily, just methodically gathering essentials, while she watched from the doorway with growing understanding that consequences extend far beyond professional embarrassment. "Are you really leaving?" she asked, voice small and uncertain. "Over one sentence I said at a party?" I stopped packing and looked at her directly. "No, I'm leaving because you meant every word of it. You didn't dismiss me accidentally or because you were nervous about the situation. You dismissed me because, in that moment, you genuinely didn't want to be associated with me in front of people you thought mattered. That reveals who you actually are when you believe the stakes are high enough." She tried arguing, explaining, justifying her actions with increasingly desperate reasoning. But the conversation was already over in my mind. When someone shows you exactly how much they value you, when they think it counts most, believe them completely. That night, she sent me a text message. "You destroyed my entire career over a misunderstanding," I replied. "You introduced yourself." The aftermath continued unfolding over the following months. Amanda eventually resigned from the firm when the stress of professional isolation became unbearable, and her attempts to transfer internally were systematically blocked. She'd tried reaching out to me several times through mutual friends and family members, but I never responded. Some betrayals reveal character so fundamentally that apologies become irrelevant to the relationship's future. The truly ironic aspect of this entire situation is that Amanda spent years systematically developing herself for exactly those kinds of high-stakes rooms, learning to network effectively, building executive presence, mastering the complex social dynamics of corporate advancement. But she never understood that real power often sits quietly in corners, evaluating and deciding, rather than performing and networking. Her ambition had blinded her to the actual influence structures operating around her, and that blindness cost her everything she'd worked so hard to achieve. David and I continue working together occasionally on similar cultural assessment projects. He never referenced that evening again directly, but our professional relationship deepened significantly afterward. In his world, character is carefully observed, meticulously recorded, and permanently remembered. Amanda learned that lesson far too late for it to matter to her career or our marriage.